ABSC. So in a previous video, we talked about KPIs, key performance indicators, at maybe a macro level, or a company level, and drill down. We looked at 6 specific KPIs that are related to that companies in our industry should be tracking. And so in this video, we're going to drill down a little bit, talk about some individual KPIs. So maybe some KPIs that would apply to a very specific segment in the organization, or, like a department or something like that, or individuals in the company.
Yeah.
So give me a little bit of thoughts on this particular thing, like transitioning from sort of macro level to micro level.
Yeah, I think it's really good to have granular KPIs. They're good, but I think it's important to go back to what we talked about in the previous video about how to set those, because that doesn't change. So again, just real quick, we're going to choose metrics that roll up to these company-wide goals.
Okay.
So we want to make sure that they always connect. We want to involve the leaders. We don't want to measure too much on any one area, so maybe 2 to 3 max individual or department KPIs. We ought to make sure that we can gather the data. And again, it goes back to it needs to be key. It doesn't need, there's a lot of things that are just performance-related things, but this need to be key indicators.
Right.
Yep.
So we're really narrowing down on the most important stuff here.
Yep.
Okay, so let's start with the operations. What are a couple of KPIs as we drill down in the organization that are in the operations piece of what we do?
Yeah, so before we chat, I want to frame up, if you think about what operations' primary goal or goals are, it's retaining customers and maintaining gross profit or gross margin. I mean, that's what they're responsible for, is keep customers, make those profitable. And so the first one, and it's individual job profitability, and so this is where job costing comes in. And I know this one can be a challenge to gather the data and put it in a report format, unless you have a job costing software. But I think this is critical, because if you look at your gross margin number and it's not your company-wide gross margin number, and you go, where are our problems? If you don't have job costing, you don't know where to look first. And so it's super important to have this.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how many times I've done consulting before, and it's mind-blowing to me how few people are actually doing this. And it's mind-blowing because knowing that we do it, I see how important it is. Like,
oh yeah,
it is like you look at big picture numbers, and like this is the very first place you dive in to see what's happening and why is it. Why are things happening the way that they are?
That's right.
And if you don't have this, it's just like a black box. You can't hardly see what's.
That's right. And at a minimum, I would say this: at a minimum, just do your direct labor costs per job. I mean, that's going to get you pretty far down the road. And again, I know that's a little bit of a challenge if you don't have a job costing software, but I think I can help people get to that. So that's individual job profitability, and then again, we're talking about operations. And I think this one is kind of one that we've come into this in the last couple of years, and it's the number of customer site visits completed. And I think this is one of the things I like about this measurement is it's easy to measure. I mean, you can literally have people count how many times that they're there, and they're required to submit just a brief a report of what they saw. And in that way, they can count that. And why I think this one is so important is it scratches 2 or 3 itches. It should, if we're doing them well, it should have some impact on customer retention. Yep. If we're in the building, the customer sees us, we're fixing problems that need to be fixed. And then it's got to lean towards team member retention. If we're out there and our managers are checking in with team members, I think we have a better opportunity to retain people. So I think this is a simple one anybody can do, and it's easy to measure.
Yep. No, that's good. And that's one I remember when I very first started in the industry, almost 20 years ago. It was something that we talked about a bit then. I remember we had this big spreadsheet, and people would check off when they had been to places.
Sure.
And it wasn't as sophisticated as what we're doing now, but it was one of the easy ways to track.
It was.
And if you see a job where nobody has been there for some amount of time, you think, man, we need to check on that. Like that's a risk hanging out there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to talking about customer satisfaction a little bit here. So something that people do often in our industry is inspections. And we talk about that's important, do inspections, blah, blah. So talk about maybe customer satisfaction versus inspections where like we determine how satisfied we are with the work. What are your thoughts on those two things?
Yeah, so I like customer satisfaction scores, and if I were to add one on the company level, I might roll in something like Net Promoter Score or some kind of customer satisfaction score. The challenge is if you're applying it to operations, and you've got all of your operations. I mean, and you're trying to gauge or trying to measure between managers, for instance. It gets a little wonky in that some people don't respond, and what's the appropriate kind of measurement that you want. So I don't think it's a bad one to check. If you're measuring inspection scores, I think that is so subjective. I think inspections are good to do, but if you're doing inspection scores as a metric, I mean, I would just be cautious of that on its own, just because it's somewhat arbitrary and it's very subjective.
And we always say people will pencil whip them. So you can just go in and write down whatever you want to write down to satisfy your superior, and you're done.
Right.
And unless there's customer input
Right.
into the inspection process, or a customer rating or something in this regard,
or
it's really difficult to tell.
Or if somehow and I know some companies have outside agencies, that might come in and inspect their buildings for them on a routine basis. I think you could do something there. But if it's our own manager scores, I mean, I just think that's highly subjective.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about sales, business development. There can be a lot here. I mean, this is my favorite piece of the pie to talk about. So what would be? I guess there could be a lot of things. You've been involved in this. We've talked about a lot of things. But what are your thoughts here on sales and business development?
Yeah, and so if I had to make an estimate, I would say most of the KPI questions that I receive are around this one. So people are asking me, hey, what are good KPIs for my salesperson or my sales team? And so I'm going to provide two that I think are most important. Again, I'm trying to say what are the most important. Again, this is going to roll up to the KPI of new business growth. So the first one would be number of connections. And this is simply a count of individual connections your salesperson or your sales team is making with prospective customers. This would exclude things that you would do like on a mass scale. So I would exclude mass emails or nurturing emails. That's not a part of this. Is one-to-one. So this is emails and drop-ins and telephone calls and LinkedIn messages. And the challenge is it's almost impossible to gather this information well if you don't have a CRM, and if the CRM is not set up to do that. And so I would encourage you, if you want to have this measurement, to have a CRM in place. And then I think the target here is I think you have to work on that and think through what your target's going to be. And again, I can help people think through what their target for connections ought to be. Secondly is number of proposal opportunities, and so we don't have the opportunity to get business if we're not having the opportunity to present proposals. I mean, this is just simply a count of the number of proposals that were submitted during a period. And then lastly is proposals won-loss percentage, and so this is a good measure of how effective you are in your pricing, what your proposals look like, how effective your proposals, and then your salesmanship in that situation. And so I think those are three really good sales-related metrics that are not too difficult to come up with.
Yeah, easier to track.
Yes, yeah.
No, that's good. And if we're doing well on those, it's very likely that we're going to be getting the kind of revenue that we're looking for.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, because you could obviously track, how much new sales did you get?
Yeah, right.
But that's a lag indicator that by the time you've measured it, it's too late.
That's right. Yeah.
These are a little bit helpful there.
Yep.
So, okay, so let's shift from talking about sales metrics and let's shift over to HR and maybe what would some metrics look like. We sort of talked about the two that are most obvious, that are probably the easiest to craft. KPIs. Let's slide over into HR. What does that look like?
Yeah. So let's think about how HR impacts our overall company goals. And I would say this, typically HR is the initiator of the recruiting and onboarding process. Now, other people have a part in that, and so we just have to keep that in mind. But I think the metrics that I'm going to talk about here are related to the recruiting and onboarding. So the first one is average time to fill open positions. And so this is the time between when HR is notified that there's an open position until the position is filled. And again, there are some things that are outside of HR's control. We just have to know that going in. But this is a decent measure of HR's effectiveness in pushing to get open positions filled. And open positions, if we have a lot of open positions, our customer service might suffer, our existing employees might get frustrated that they're having to pick up extra work. So this is really important. And then another one kind of related to it is the percentage of jobs with open positions. So it's just, it's kind of the same information, but it's a little bit different way of looking at it.
Yeah. Okay. What about turnover and retention or employee satisfaction scores?
Yeah.
Are these important? Is that something we should?
Yeah. I think we mentioned retention as a company-wide KPI because, but HR plays just a fraction of that. And I think a lot of times we push the turnover KPIs over into HR, and they have a portion of the responsibility there. So I think I think you have to caution about putting that on them. And the same applies to employee satisfaction scores. I think it's important to get employee satisfaction scores, but there's a myriad of factors beyond just what HR does that impact that.
Yeah, and if you're holding someone accountable for something, it needs to be something they have a significant control over the outcome of the thing you're holding them accountable for.
That's correct.
Otherwise, it'll lead to frustration.
Yeah, tons of frustration. So yes, you're right. Yep.
So what about administrative, back office? Yeah. Think that side of things. Maybe what would be some things that would pop up there that we'd want to measure on an ongoing basis? Yeah,
and so again, going back, how does this particular area of the company impact our company? And I would say it rolls up into the cash number more than anything. And so the first one would be accounts receivable aging. Again, this rolls up. This is a measure of how effective our administrative services or accounting team, whatever, back office team is of submitting invoices, making sure invoices are correct, and staying on top of those that are outstanding. And so I would encourage folks to have KPIs on 0 to 30 days, 31 to 60 days, those aging ranges. So that's AR aging. And then on the flip side, I would do accounts payable aging. And you think, well, why is that important? Well, what it can have an impact on is if you're not paying on time, you may be incurring some penalties, and it's just not good business. And then if you're paying on time or paying early, you may be able to get some discounts that are associated with that. So those are two measurements that kind of roll up, or those are KPIs that kind of roll up to the cash.
And it shows their effectiveness in what they're doing, but also how we're doing from a cash standpoint.
That's right.
It can be a bit of a lead indicator there.
That's right.
All right, this is a 2 to 3 per area of the organization. And again, we don't want to overload our people with KPIs to measure, because at some point everyone will stop doing it. It'll be too much. So keep it minimal and small, but get started. And some of these, maybe you can apply some of these. So if there's anything we can do to help in kickstarting that process for you, if you need some more information, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll see you next time.